The case against Cos Little, charged with striking Burnett Beauregard, colored with the spoke, was dismissed. The evidence showed that the darky advanced in a threatening manner towards Mr. Little. Darky.
Oh, yeah. Unfortunately,
Wow.
That's very typical of that era, yes. Now, under Kentucky law, an African-American could swear out a warrant, but the deck is stacked against him. Remember, slavery ended in Kentucky just 32 years before. Violence against African-Americans was tragically common in this period. There were lynchings in this county. For him to have the courage to go to City Hall and to swear out a warrant is pretty amazing.
Wow.
Jerome Bettis is in Paducah, Kentucky with Professor Barry Craig. He just discovered that in 1897, his great-grandfather Burnett pressed charges against his boss for assault.
1897. This would make him 21 years old, but yet they refer to him as a colored boy.
That is a derogatory term that whites used against African Americans going back to slavery days. You could be 60 years old and they would still call you boy. Paducah was part of the Jim Crow South. Segregation and race discrimination were the law.
After the Civil War ended in 1865, Congress amended the Constitution prohibiting slavery, making blacks full citizens and granting freed black men the right to vote. It was a glorious moment, but it wouldn't last. As the Union Army pulled out of the defeated South, Southern states found ways to circumvent the federal legislation. They enacted the Jim Crow laws, which legalized segregation in public places and prevented black citizens from voting, thus reversing many advances toward equality made by African Americans in the post-Civil War era. When 21-year-old Burnett Beauregard bravely stood up for his rights in 1897, the odds were heavily against him.
What do you think came of this situation with Burnett?
Well, let's just go a few days forward, see what turns up.
Okay. Here it is. It says, the case against Cos Little, charged with striking Burnett Beauregard, colored with the spoke, was dismissed. The evidence showed that the darky advanced in a threatening manner towards Mr. Little. Darky.
Oh, yeah. Unfortunately,
Wow.
That's very typical of that era, yes. Now, under Kentucky law, an African-American could swear out a warrant, but the deck is stacked against him. Remember, slavery ended in Kentucky just 32 years before. Violence against African-Americans was tragically common in this period. There were lynchings in this county. For him to have the courage to go to City Hall and to swear out a warrant is pretty amazing.
Wow. So he was a bit of a rebel from the looks of it. So this really helps me because with the divorce that I saw earlier, coupled with this rumor that he was this rebel rouser, I was starting to develop a negative perception. And now, I don't think that applies. I think he was a strong-willed African-American man in a time that you really couldn't be a strong-willed African-American man. It's amazing how much information I've been able to find on Burnett, and I'd love to see how much farther up the Beauregard tree I can go. I do know of his father, Abe Beauregard. Don't know much about him, but I would love to see if we can kind of find some information on Abe Beauregard.
Well, let's, again, try the database and see what we come up with.
Okay. Okay, here we go. October 8th, 1902. Here it is here. Abe Beauregard has filed suit in the circuit court against the Illinois Central for $2,000 in damages for injuries received by being struck by a Illinois Central train while walking along the track. He's suing the railroad for $2,000.
It's about, what, $48,000 or so today?
Wow.
That's a huge amount of money. So here you've got a guy taking on this giant corporation. That takes quite a bit of guts, too.
Wow, that says a lot. Is there any way that we can find out what happened? Can I find out?
Your best bet there is to go to Frankfort, to the Kentucky State Archives. That's where they have the circuit court records.
I'm going to meet with Jennifer Frazier, and hopefully she can enlighten me a little bit more about Abe Bogard. I've been doing some research on my lineage, and I'm going all the way back to my great-great-grandfather, Abe Bogard, and I found there was a suit that he filed against the Illinois Central Railroad. I wanted to try to find out what happened with this suit.
Well, we're gonna have to slip on our white gloves.
Okay.
We've got original case documents. It's 100 years old.
Okay,
So
gotcha.
the first document to look at is the petition. Petition is the first document that is filed in the court to get the case started.
The plaintiff, Abe Bogard, says that the defendant carelessly, recklessly, and wrongfully ran its engine and train upon and against plaintiff. He has been damaged in the sum of $2,000. Wow. Abe Bogard. This is signature?
Well, it says his mark.
His mark?
Yep.
My great-great-grandfather, his signature is X?
Yes, I think that he probably couldn't write, and so someone else wrote his name, and then he put the X, and that's his mark.
That's sad. It's just disturbing. That's something. You just, excuse me, because as I'm reading this, it popped out at me, and it's striking because it brings in the reality that this was a man that was probably involved in slavery, and he couldn't write his name. And he's fighting a huge railroad at this time.
Yes.
It's amazing.
The Illinois Central Railroad was a huge railroad. It was the biggest employer in Paducah. It was one of the biggest railroads at the time.
Okay.
And they had the lawyers and the money to fight every single case. They would take cases all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court if they could.
How can he afford, I mean, these type of lawyers, they couldn't come cheap.
Well, Hendrick and Miller, who represented your great-great-grandfather, were very prominent attorneys in Western Kentucky. They probably believed in the populace ideology, which was the common man versus the elite. And they probably took this case without charging or charged a very minimal fee.
Gotcha. Do we know how this case went?
Abe's lawyers actually got it to trial. Now, this would have been an all-white jury. Jurors were picked through tax records, and you had to be a landowner of good reputation in the community.
Not good for Abe.
Not good for Abe. And one of the things that the railroad claimed was that Abe was trespassing. He wasn't an employee, and he wasn't a passenger. He was a trespasser. So Abe and his attorneys filed this reply.
Plaintiff denies it was negligence in him to go upon defendant's track and says he was there by the invitation and with the knowledge of the defendant. Prior to this date, he had been in the employ of the defendant. So Abe is claiming that he used to work for the railroad and had been invited to the station to talk about returning to work and just kind of got the okay to come back to work, and he gets struck. And if that's the case, he wasn't trespassing.
Well, that's actually the issue the jury had to decide. They had to decide whether they believed Abe or whether or not to believe his employers, the railroad company.
I think I know what this all-white jury is thinking.
All right. On the back of this document is the jury verdict.
Okay.
Jerome Bettis is in Frankfort, Kentucky, on the trail of his great-great-grandfather, Abe Bogard. He just discovered that in 1904, Abe was in the midst of a lawsuit against the Illinois Central Railroad after being struck by one of their trains. Jerome is at the state archives to find out the verdict in the case.
On the back of this document is the jury verdict.
Okay. We, the undersigned jurors, find for the plaintiff. Wow. For the plaintiff. And fix the damages by $375. Wow. He actually won.
He won.
I would have, in a million years, never have thought, I mean, everything was stacked against him.
Yeah.
Everything. Man, this is a huge, huge victory for Abe. My goodness.